Mr. Bison flips!
Mr. Bison flips! Mr. Bison flips! Mr. Bison flips!
Gwen Harwood's The Glass Jar is quite interesting for us exploring the idea of identity, as the poem deals with a child going through one event in his life that dramatically transforms how he perceives the world and those around him. If we start off with kind of an initial summary of the whole poem, we sort of go through stages for this child. The first stanza deal with the child being quite confident during the day. He enjoys being awake in the daytime, but he knows that the night that's oncoming is quite frightful, and therefore he needs to take some sort of protective measures to make sure that he's safe. He obviously has strong faith both in the protective nature of the sun, as in the physical sun that's shining, but also there's a very strong religious undertone running through the poem, reflecting Harwood's firm Catholic beliefs. But there's also belief in the protective nature of the parents, which we'll see later on. And that's obviously where the big betrayal comes in, where he's really, when we get into the fifth stanza particularly, the disenchantment with the mother in terms of trusting her, and the direct betrayal by the father, the way he perceives that the father is a rival that really contributes to his downfall. And then how this changes the child towards the end of the poem, where he really, it's daytime again and he regains some of that confidence, but he's definitely had there's been a change in the way that he perceives the world. So if we move on to the first stanza on the poem, do this. He's initially, it's just a child, so it's not very specific who we're dealing with. Initially we don't even know if it's a boy or a girl. A child, one summer's evening, so it's not specific time either, but we get the sense of warmth and calm that a summer's evening would have with it. And we get the naivety of the child in that he soaked a glass jar in the reeling sun. So there's a sense of the sun being deeply affected by something and kind of stumbling. At this point, sun probably only representing the actual sun. Hoping to keep, when day was done, and all the sun's disciples cloaked in dream and darkness from his passion fled, this host, this pulse of light beside his bed. So obviously here the sun is now transformed. We're using a pun here to transform this sun into a biblical allusion to the sun, S-O-N, and the disciples that would have been following him. So there's a sense of sort of the last night in the Garden of Gethsemane, where the disciples are going to sleep and the son has to wake by himself, waiting during the darkness for everything. And the passions fled from him, and we're now dealing with a host, referring presumably both to the bread of the Eucharist as well as the group of disciples that are following this sun, this pulse of light. So again, there's that kind of I am the light of the world, but also the light of the sun in the sky that he's tried to retain in his jar. So the jar of light really becomes, physically, obviously, he's going to be in a dark room, he's got a jar full of light, but metaphorically, it's also now a monstrance, as we see in the next, which is one of those things used in a Catholic communion ceremony to represent the presence of Christ. So we've got the bread and the wine, which is obviously the body and the blood of Christ, but there's also that monstrance to represent the presence of God even after the wine and the bread has been consumed. The monstrance on the Catholic Eucharist would look something like this. You may have seen something similar on an altar in a Catholic church at some point. Yes, my outside perception of the whole ceremony of the communion in the Catholic Church is probably grossly misunderstood, but I think it's rough enough to make you understand this poem. So, wrapped in a scarf, this monstrance stood, ready to bless, to exorcise monsters, that whispering would rise nightly from the intricate wood that ringed his bed, to light with total power the holy commonplace of field and flower. So the child has high hopes for this monstrance, this jar of light. He's hoping that it's going to bless, to exorcise, and to light his room. So make sure that exorcise the monsters and light up the room to keep those spirits away. So we're using that tricolon, 3 infinite phrases to really emphasize the great hope that clearly the child is showing at this point in his monster, or his glass jar rather. It's interesting how it's using the word wood for. It's not the monsters that whispering might rise out of bed or that could rise out of the bed, but they would rise. So he knows that they will definitely rise out of the bed when he goes to sleep, telling us that this is a child who suffers nightmares on a nightly basis. In stanza 3, we get to enter into this nightmare of the child. We start with a very matter-of-fact statement, truncated sentence, just to take us into the nightmare. He slept, full stop. That's enough for us to understand that we're now dealing with the dream. His sidelong violence summoned fiends whose Mosaic Vision saw his heart entire, pincer and claw, trident and vampire fang, envenomed with his most secret hate, reached and came near to pierce him in the thicket of his fear. So we get the collage, if you like, of these creatures. We don't see them entirely, we have to imagine what they look like, but we do get enough pieces of them to work as a metonymy to represent these characters in their pieces, right? We don't use the entire beings, we just use pieces of them to represent them, i.e. we're using metonymy. So we're talking about pincer and claw, trident, vampire fang, all of which are destined to pierce and to attack and to destroy, or at least injure, this boy in his sleep. So they're all pieces that are focused at attacking him. The fact that we're dealing with sidelong violence seems to be that it's not direct, i.e. maybe it's his subconscious, maybe it's his imagination, maybe it's what happens to you in a dream. But they're definitely fiends. The Mosaic Vision presumably means that there's more than one, there's several people looking at him, or we're dealing with that kind of broken vision that you would get from a fly who has so many different segments in their eye, and the way that they see things is kind of in a mosaic type of vision. But all of these items put next to each other obviously give us a great sense of fearfulness in the child. And that synesthetic sentence that concludes the stanza, that they're going to pierce him in the thicket of his fear. So we're not trying to pierce his heart or pierce his fingertip or pierce his something else. It's piercing his fear, which obviously is physically not really possible, i.e. we're dealing with synesthesia. So the child recovers and he wakes, recall his jar of light, and trembling reached one hand to grope the mantling scarf away. So he wakes up, realizes it's okay because I've got my monstrance next to me, I'm protected. So he pulls the scarf off the jar, but alas, it doesn't work out. The sun, neither the sun with a U or the sun with an O, steps out of the jar. The jar is still dark, like everything else in the room. So that naivety that the child was showing in stanza 1 comes to nothing because there is no light in the darkness. And so the effect of that is, then hope fell headlong from its eagle height. So we get that alliteration of the fricative H, the headlong height, really emphasizes hope fell headlong from his height, emphasizes the force with which his hope is falling. So his action of trying to fight these monsters failed, therefore the next action he has to take is flight. So through the dark house he ran, sobbing his loss, so crying all the way down to the last clearing that he dared not cross. This clearing, of course, is the parents' bedroom threshold. And so he stands in the doorway of the parents' room, but that feels impenetrable. He's not going to enter their room without their permission. So beyond this threshold lies the bedroom where his comforter lay in his rival's fast embrace. So we get the comforter, the mother, and his rival being his father, and the embrace between them. So there's obviously a very strong Oedipal complex thing happening here. If you don't know the myth of Oedipus and how Freud has used that for his psychology, then you might want to stop the video or come back to that later on and look up what does that myth actually mean. And girls, if you think it's strange, then the Electra complex is the Freudian equivalent to the Oedipal for men. So not only is this mother laying in the rival's fast embrace, but she's faithless, and she wouldn't turn her face from the gross violence done to her. Love's proud executants played from a score no child could read or realize. And then we start off the next sentence to really bring us into the next stanza. So really we're dealing with the enjambment here is meant to bridge the stanzas to really heighten the pace between the two stanzas, and to show that this child once again takes flight. So obviously the next three lines of that stanza really emphasize the incomprehensible nature of the copulation act to a child, and how yes, the parents might be proud executants of this act, but the child perceives this as gross violence being done to the mother, and the parents, in the poet's words, are playing from a score no child could read or realize. So we're now moving into to musical imagery, which is sort of Harwood's other big influence. So it really, her poetry is influenced by the Romantic movement, but also by her Catholic ideas and themes, and finally her musical imagery, because she was a great music scholar. And here we see that music and imagery starting to emerge, but we'll see more of that in the next stanza. So we're now moving very quickly through the enjambment into the next stanza, right? So once more to bed, and to worse dreams he went. A ring of skeletons compelled his father with theirs. His father held fiddle and bow, and scraped assent to the malignant ballet. And the child dreamed this dance perpetual, and waking screamed. The references in this stanza to a ring of skeleton and to this dance-like thing seem to have be recalling something like the Danse Macabre. This is the wood etching by Hans Holbein, I think, from the 1500s. But it's a very common sort of medieval theme about human mortality. It's kind of meant to be memento mori, to remind us about our mortality. So here we have the skeletons playing music and dancing together. And that's kind of the type of malignant ballet that we're dealing with. It's a hard word to say that. In this poem, it seems to be that sort of keep that sort of picture in mind. When we look at this ring of skeletons, compelled his step with theirs. His father held the fiddle and the bow, so he's the one playing the fiddle and scraping the assent to the malignant ballet. So he's the one supporting it and making it happen in his dream. And the child dreamed this dance perpetual, so it just keeps going and going and going, frightening him and more until he wakes up screaming. And the fact that the ongoing and the perpetual nature of that is emphasized even further by the fact that the stanza is not completed by a full stop. Instead, we conclude the sentence in fresh morning to his windowsill in the next stanza, which seems to have there's a distinct shift in the tone and the mood as we move into the last stanza. So moving from that scream into the fresh morning, so it's full of hope, calm, there's rebirth, rejuvenation in the next morning. As ravening birds began their song, the resurrected sun, so again we get that references to the sun with an O, the resurrection, new birth, same as the rebirth that we get in the morning. So we're continuing that allusion from stanza 1 and 2. Whose long triumph through flower-brushed fields would fill the night's gulf and hungers, came to wink and laugh in a glass jar beside a crumpled scarf. So the motive, or the actual jar, comes back from stanza 1, but it's interesting how the sun is not, it's now in the jar winking and laughing, and it's definitely something you should explore in your conversation about this poem, whether it's winking and laughing, haha, wasn't that funny, and I'm always here on your side, or whether it's winking and laughing because it's mocking him. So there should be a question mark after mocking. I'm not insinuating that is the correct answer, but rather raising the question: is he mocking, or is this is the resurrected sun in the jar there to be reassuring and funny? Which is something you should definitely think about when you look at the poem. If your poem has these last 2 lines, please cross them off, or even more of a poem, because this is the end of the poem. These belong to a poem called Trist Trist, and should not have been accidentally printed in your edition, but they were in mine, so they probably are in yours too. But Crumpled Scarf is is that sort of anticlimactic conclusion to the poem, and the reason why maybe mocking might be the way to read the poem, because why doesn't it end on the winking and laughing, but rather it ends a wink and a laugh in a glass jar beside a crumpled scarf. So the emphasis, to me at least, lands on the crumpled scarf at the end of the poem, which to me is, comes back to when the hope fell headlong from its eagle height in the 4th stanza, because that's what happened when the scarf was initially crumpled. So consider the impact of those last words and the last 2 lines particularly on the meaning of the whole poem. Is this about a child who goes through this experience and comes out reassured in the end? Sort of, yes, things might be bad, but in the end I am reassured in my belief in the sun, whether it's sun with a U or sun with an O, or is this a child that comes out on the other side having lost that faith and that hope and the reassurance that was provided previously? So in summation, think about what Gwen Harwood, the poet, is doing in this poem in terms of expressing ideas about this child's identity, and which of all these techniques that I've tried to mention are the central ones in developing the idea of this child. Jot those ideas down, write down any questions or disagreements that you've got, and bring those to Monday's Socratic Circle discussion.